Stand in Times Square today and glance up at that national debt clock. You'll see numbers spinning so wildly you'd think the machine is malfunctioning. $36.2 trillion. And we're racing toward $38 trillion before 2026 ends. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine paying off $38 trillion at $1 every single second. You'd need 1.2 million years. Stack those dollars in $1 bills? You're building a tower stretching 2.6 million miles into space. That's flying to the moon and back 10 times over. For years, the so-called experts kept telling us to relax. Deficits aren't important, they'd say. We're borrowing from ourselves, so what's the big deal? They convinced us the debt was manageable as long as our economy kept growing. They made it sound like monopoly money. Just numbers on a screen with zero real-world impact. Here's the truth. They weren't being honest with you. Everything shifted in 2025. We've crossed a threshold there's no coming back from. Right now, for the first time ever in America's history, our government pays more in interest on this debt than it spends on our entire military budget. Let that sink in for a moment. We're paying more to old bondholders than we're investing in protecting our nation today. Our interest payments actually exceed what we spend on Medicare. That interest bill just crossed $1.13 trillion yearly, and it's climbing fast. This triggers something economists call the debt spiral. Picture your personal finances. If your credit cards are maxed out, you'd cut back immediately. Cancel Netflix, skip dining out, tighten the belt. But governments can't operate like that. Most of their spending is locked in: Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, debt interest. These aren't optional, they're legal obligations. Politicians can't touch them without changing laws, and nobody's voting to slash benefits because that's career suicide. So what happens instead? They borrow even more money just to cover the interest on existing debt. It's like opening a brand new credit card just to make minimum payments on your old ones. This pushes total debt higher. More debt means bigger interest payments next year. Bigger payments force more borrowing. It's a mathematical trap that eventually implodes, and here's what should terrify you. There's no normal escape route from this mess. Only 3 possible solutions exist, and 2 are impossible. Option 1, austerity. Brutal spending cuts combined with massive tax hikes. To actually balance our books, the government would need to slash spending by 30% across the board, or raise everyone's taxes by 40%. Translation: either your Social Security check gets cut by 1/3 or your income taxes double. Neither scenario is happening. Any politician even suggesting this gets voted out instantly. Austerity equals political death. It's completely off the table. Option 2, default. The government could simply announce, "We're not paying you back." Argentina did this. Russia tried it too. But for America, this would be like dropping a nuclear bomb on the global economy. The entire world financial system runs on one belief: U.S. Treasury bonds are completely safe. If America defaults, every bank worldwide becomes insolvent overnight. The global economy implodes. Your credit card stops working, gas stations shut down. We're talking about complete financial Armageddon. So defaulting isn't happening either. That leaves us with just one option, the third path that every collapsing empire throughout history eventually chooses. Ancient Rome took it. Weimar Germany walked this road. Post-war Britain followed the same trail. It's the easiest path politically. They call it the soft default. You don't refuse to pay your debts. You pay back every single penny. But here's the catch: you repay it using currency that's worth dramatically less than when you borrowed it. You just print whatever difference you need, you let inflation erase the debt. And while that's happening, you're also erasing the savings of every American who trusted the system. This isn't some wild conspiracy theory. This is actual government policy. It's unfolding right now as we speak. And guess who's footing the bill? You are. Coming up next, I'm revealing the 3 specific weapons the government is using to drain your wealth invisibly. We're diving into financial repression, CPI manipulation, and the captive buyer system. These are the mechanisms behind the greatest wealth transfer in modern times. This is exactly how they make $38 trillion vanish, by making your paycheck vanish too. Understanding how the government plans to evaporate $38 trillion doesn't require an economics degree. You just need to crack open a history book. Because none of this is innovative. We're literally copying the exact same strategy America used after World War II, and it actually worked back then. The real question is, will it work again? Back in 1945, U.S. national debt hit 119% of our GDP, the highest level we'd ever seen. The government had borrowed insane amounts to fund the war effort. Everyone expected we'd spend the next few decades grinding away at that debt through higher taxes. But that's not how things played out. Instead, they pulled off a trick called financial repression. Between 1945 and 1955, the Federal Reserve artificially froze interest rates at 2.5%. Meanwhile, actual inflation was running over 6% annually. Do the calculation yourself. When you own a government bond paying you 2.5% interest, but your living costs are jumping 6% every year, you're bleeding 3.5% of your buying power annually. The government repaid every single dollar they owed you. But those dollars now bought half the groceries, half the gas, half the housing they used to. Across 10 years, bondholders watched almost 40% of their real wealth evaporate. The government didn't actually pay off the debt. They just transferred the cost onto the people who'd lent them money. The debt-to-GDP ratio dropped from 119% down to 66%. Not because anyone repaid anything, but because they inflated the debt's value into nothing. And bondholders were completely trapped. Laws prevented you from earning better interest rates. Banks were legally prohibited from paying you more than 1% on savings accounts. They called this Regulation Q. You couldn't move your money overseas because of capital controls. You were stuck. Your life savings were being stolen in slow motion, and you were powerless to stop it. This scheme worked smoothly for a decade, but eventually people caught on. By the 1960s, Americans started buying tangible assets for protection: stocks, real estate, gold. By the 1970s, inflation spiraled completely out of control, forcing the Fed to jack interest rates up to 20% just to kill it. Today, the government is running the same playbook, but they've upgraded their toolkit. They've learned from the 1970s disasters, and they're using 3 modern mechanisms to trap you more effectively than ever before. Mechanism 1, the captive buyer. In a free market, when the U.S. government is drowning in $38 trillion of debt while running $2 trillion deficits yearly, investors would demand sky-high interest rates. They'd tell the government, "You're a terrible credit risk. I need 8% or 10% interest to compensate for that danger." But the government can't afford paying 8%. If they paid 8% interest on $38 trillion, their annual interest bill would exceed $3 trillion. That's more than every income tax collected in an entire year. The government would collapse. So instead of paying fair market rates, they've rigged the entire game. They've created captive buyers. These are institutions legally forced to purchase government debt, regardless of how terrible the interest rate is. Here's how this scam works. After the 2008 crisis, the government passed new banking rules. Basel III, Dodd-Frank, politicians sold these laws to Americans as making banks safer. But hidden deep in these regulations is a requirement. Banks must maintain a certain level of high-quality liquid assets, or HQLA, and guess what automatically qualifies as high quality? U.S. Treasury bonds by definition. This means banks are legally required to buy Treasury bonds, even when those bonds are awful investments. Even when bonds pay 2% while inflation runs at 5%. Meaning you're losing 3% yearly, banks must buy them anyway. It's not optional. If banks don't hold enough treasuries, regulators shut them down immediately. Insurance companies face the exact same trap. Insurance regulations force them to hold safe assets backing their policies. Treasuries are classified as safe automatically, so insurance companies have no choice but to buy them. Pension funds are caught in the same net. They're required to hold investment-grade bonds. Treasuries get AA rated. No matter how massive the government debt becomes, because rating agencies assume the government can always print money to pay you. The result? Roughly $12 trillion in U.S. government debt is held by institutions legally required to hold it regardless of whether it makes any financial sense. This creates fake demand. It keeps interest rates artificially lower than they should be. And you're the one paying the price. Your pension fund isn't buying government bonds because it's a smart move. It's buying them because the law forces it to. And when those bonds lose money, your pension benefits get slashed. The government is forcing your retirement savings to lend it money at rates guaranteed to make you lose. Mechanism 2, the broken thermometer. If you want to pay someone less but you promise to adjust payments based on inflation, the simplest trick is lying about what inflation actually is. Social Security payments increase yearly based on something called the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. If CPI reports inflation at 3%, Social Security checks rise 3%. Treasury inflation-protected securities called TIPS also adjust using CPI. Government pensions adjust using CPI, so the government has enormous financial incentive to report the lowest possible CPI number. They accomplish this through what they call methodological changes. These are technical adjustments that sound incredibly boring but are actually legalized fraud. Let me show you 3 examples. First, substitution bias. The original method measured inflation using a fixed basket of goods. If you bought steak weekly and steak cost $10 per pound, the CPI tracked steak's price. Simple enough, but in 1999, the government changed their methodology. Now, when steak jumps to $15 per pound, the government assumes you'll stop buying steak and switch to hamburger at $6 per pound. So, instead of reporting your food costs increased 50%, they report your food costs dropped 40% because you're buying cheaper food. This completely ignores the reality that you wanted steak, not hamburger. Your quality of life declined. But the CPI claims you're better off because you're spending less money. It's absolutely insane. Second, hedonic quality adjustments. Let's say a new car costs $40,000 this year. Last year it was $35,000, but now it has a backup camera. Who decides what a backup camera is worth? The government does. And shockingly, the government always decides. Quality improvements are worth exactly enough to cancel out most of the price increase. Third, they changed their averaging method. They switched from simple averaging to something called geometric weighting. The effect is that items with the fastest price increases get less weight in the formula. So the CPI automatically reports lower inflation than what you're actually experiencing in real life. Add all these tricks together, and official CPI runs about 2 to 3 percentage points below reality. When the government reports 3% inflation, the real number using the old 1980 methodology is closer to 6%. Independent organizations like ShadowStats calculate inflation using original methods. They consistently show inflation double what the government reports. Why does this matter so much? Because over 10 years, if the government reports 30% cumulative inflation but the real number is 60%, your Social Security benefits have lost half their buying power. You're getting paid in full, but those dollars buy half as much. The government is literally gaslighting you about living costs to save money on its obligations to you. Mechanism 3. Fiscal dominance. For decades, the Federal Reserve operated independently. The Fed's job was protecting the dollar's value. When government spending caused inflation, the Fed would raise interest rates to fight it. Even if higher rates damaged the economy, even if they made government borrowing more expensive, the Fed did its job. But once government debt grows large enough, the Fed loses its independence. This is called fiscal dominance. The debt becomes so massive that if the Fed raised rates high enough to actually crush inflation, it would bankrupt the government. So the Fed stops fighting inflation. It starts serving the Treasury instead. We entered fiscal dominance in 2020. Here's how you know. The government spent $5 trillion more than it collected in taxes during COVID. Who purchased the $5 trillion in bonds financing that spending? The Federal Reserve did. The Fed created $5 trillion brand new money from nothing and used it to buy government bonds. This is called monetizing the debt. It's printing money to fund government spending. And when foreign countries like China and Japan started dumping their treasury holdings, who stepped in to buy the bonds they were selling? The Fed did. China's treasury holdings have crashed from $1.3 trillion to $770 billion. Japan's holdings have dropped significantly too. Foreign demand is collapsing. But treasury yields aren't spiking the way they should. Why not? Because the Fed is buying the bonds foreigners are selling. This is the captive buyer system in full action. The Fed can't allow interest rates to rise to their natural level because it would demolish the government's budget. So the Fed keeps buying bonds, which creates new money, which causes inflation. The result is an everything bubble. Stock prices disconnect from any reality. Real estate prices disconnect from reality. Your 401k goes up. Your house value goes up. But it's all a mirage. You have more dollars in your account. But each individual dollar is worth less. Your assets are rising in nominal dollar terms, but not in real purchasing power. And here's the trap they've set. If you keep your money in a savings account earning 3% while actual inflation runs at 6%, you're losing 3% annually. Over 10 years, you lose 30% of your purchasing power. You are the one paying off the national debt. You are the lender. The government is the borrower. They're repaying you in money worth 30% less than when they borrowed it from you. The only escape from this system is to stop holding dollars. You must own assets the government cannot print. Real estate, stocks, gold, commodities, Bitcoin, things that rise when the dollar falls. But here's the darkest part. Not everyone can escape this trap, and that's intentional. This wealth transfer isn't hitting everyone equally. In fact, it's the primary driver of the wealth inequality that's ripping this country apart. To understand why, we need to discuss something called the Cantillon effect. Richard Cantillon was a French economist in the 1700s. He observed that when new money gets created, it doesn't spread evenly through the economy like rain falling on everyone equally. Instead, new money enters at a specific point, and people closest to that entry point benefit massively. People farthest away get crushed. When the Federal Reserve prints $3 trillion, where does that money go first? It doesn't get mailed to your address. It doesn't get dropped on Main Street America. It goes straight to Wall Street. The Fed buys bonds from J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and BlackRock. These institutions receive the new money first, and they get it at zero interest. What do they do with this free money? They buy assets immediately, stocks, real estate, bonds, artwork. By the time this new money trickles down to you through wages or a stimulus check, prices have already skyrocketed. The wealthy got money before inflation hit. You got money after inflation hit? This is exactly why wealth inequality has exploded since 2008, the top 10%. People who own stocks and real estate have watched their wealth skyrocket. The bottom 90%, people who earn wages and keep money in savings accounts, have watched their purchasing power collapse. The national debt is being paid off by liquidating the middle class. Here's the mathematics. The bottom 50% of Americans by wealth hold roughly $3.7 trillion in total assets. Most of that is cash, savings accounts, and small retirement accounts. If inflation runs 5% yearly while their savings earn 2%, they lose 3% per year. Over 10 years, that's a 30% loss. That's $1.1 trillion transferred from the poorest half of Americans directly to the government through inflation. The middle 40%, the middle class, hold about $38 trillion. Much of that sits in retirement accounts and home equity. But $8 trillion is in bonds and savings accounts. If those lose 3% yearly for 10 years, that's $2.4 trillion transferred from middle-class Americans to the government. These are inflation hedges. They rise when the dollar falls. The wealthy lose money on bonds they hold, but they profit on everything else. And if they carry debt, they win even bigger. When you borrow $10 million at a 3% fixed rate and inflation runs at 5%, you're repaying the loan in dollars worth less every year. You effectively reduce your debt burden by 2% annually just by waiting. The ultra-wealthy, the top 0.1%, hold almost zero cash or bonds. Everything is in real assets. They borrow at low fixed rates. They invest in things that appreciate. Over the next decade, this system will transfer approximately $5.6 trillion from the bottom 90% to the government and the top 10%. This is the largest peacetime wealth confiscation in human history, and it's happening right now as you watch this. It's disguised as supply chain problems, corporate greed, and bad luck, but it's deliberate policy, the endgame, the final solution. But the government has one more weapon they haven't deployed yet, and this one is the most dangerous of all. It's being built right now in the basement of the Federal Reserve. It's called a central bank digital currency, a CBDC. Right now, the government's ability to control your money is limited by one thing: physical cash exists. If the Fed sets interest rates at -2%, meaning they charge you 2% yearly just to hold money in the bank, you could simply withdraw your cash and stick it under your mattress. Physical cash is your escape hatch. It's your financial freedom. A CBDC eliminates that escape hatch completely. When the dollar becomes purely digital, the Fed gains total control. They can implement negative interest rates instantly. Your bank balance decreases 2% per year whether you like it or not. They can put expiration dates on money. Your stimulus check must be spent within 60 days or it disappears forever. They can track every single dollar you spend and block any transaction they don't approve of. This isn't science fiction anymore. China is already doing this with the digital yuan. They can see every transaction. They can turn off your money if you do something the government dislikes. If you donate to the wrong political cause, your money stops working. The digital dollar is the ultimate solution to the debt crisis. It gives the government power to devalue your savings with a keystroke. It removes your ability to escape their system. The transition to a cashless society isn't about convenience. It's not about stopping crime. It's about ensuring that when the great wealth transfer accelerates, there's no exit door. The verdict: the United States is defaulting on its debt. It's a slow, quiet, polite default. But make no mistake, it's a default. That $38 trillion will never be repaid in real terms. The government is going to inflate it into nothing, and you're going to pay for it. The winners will be people who own scarce assets. Real estate, stocks, gold, Bitcoin, businesses. Things that can't be printed. The losers will be people who trust the system. People keeping their money in savings accounts. People buying long-term government bonds. People who believe the official inflation numbers. And the rules have completely changed. If you're not paying attention right now, you're already losing, but there's one more chapter to this story. In 1933, when the debt spiral was spinning wildly and the dollar was collapsing, the United States government did something unthinkable. They made owning gold illegal. They sent federal agents door to door to confiscate the one asset that could protect you from their money printing. Executive Order 6102. If you didn't turn in your gold, you faced 10 years in prison.